Caution is supposed to protect you. That is the deal. You pay attention, you ask the right questions, you check the statements, and the caution pays you back in safety. Ethan Westwood believed that deal completely. He was 74 years old, a retired accountant from Manchester, a man who had spent 4 decades reading the numbers behind other people's decisions and knowing, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood money at a structural level, exactly what he was looking at. He checked, he monitored, he reviewed it, he asked questions that most people wouldn't have known to ask, and he still lost £370,000. Because Gianna Soto wasn't stealing from him carelessly, she was stealing from him precisely, in the dark spaces between the things he knew to look for. This is what happens when a careful man meets someone more careful than he is. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I've been sitting with for the better part of a year now, is that I did everything right. Not almost right, not mostly right with a few careless gaps. Right, by any standard I'd have applied to a client back in the days when I was still practicing. I monitored the accounts. I reviewed the statements every month. I asked questions that made Gianna pause before answering, which I took as evidence of her thoroughness rather than her buying time. I cross-referenced figures. I flagged things that looked unusual and sought explanations. I applied, as best I could in a context I was still learning, the professional habits of a man who spent 41 years working with other people's money and watching it carefully on their behalf, and £370,000 still vanished, piece by piece, through methods I didn't understand and accounts I didn't know existed. Over 14 months that I spent believing I had the picture in front of me when I was looking at a copy of a copy, carefully assembled to show me exactly what she needed me to see. I'm going to try to explain how that works, because when I've described this to people, friends, my daughter Claire, the financial crimes investigator who took my statement, there's always a moment where they look at me with a particular expression, an expression that says, "But you're an accountant. How did an accountant not catch this?" And the answer to that question is the real story, more than the money, more than Gianna herself. The answer is about the specific kind of sophistication that a determined, intelligent person can deploy against even a vigilant target, and about the way that vigilance itself can be turned into a tool against the vigilant person. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, which for me begins in Manchester 2 years before any of this happened. I retired at 71 after 41 years in accounting, the last 22 as a senior partner at a mid-sized firm in Coralton that handled mainly small business and private client work. Not glamorous work, not the City of London variety of finance, but real work, careful work, the work of a man who understood that the difference between a client who ended up comfortable and a client who ended up in trouble was almost always found in the details that other people found too tedious to examine. I was good at tedious. I had made a career of it and was not sorry about that. My wife Helen died 3 years before I retired. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, the particular cruelty of a disease that hides itself well until hiding is no longer possible. We'd been married 47 years and we'd had Claire together, and Claire had her own family in Leeds, and when Helen went, the house in Didsbury became a different kind of place than it had been. Not terrible. I kept it up. I kept myself up. I continued at the firm because the work was the structure, and the structure was what kept everything else from becoming formless. When I eventually retired, it was because I chose to, not because the grief had made me incapable. That distinction matters to me. The Philippines came up through a television program, of all things, a documentary about expat retirement in Southeast Asia, the kind of thing that gets shown on weekday afternoons and that I happened to be watching during a bout of insomnia in my first year of retirement. I watched it with the half attention of someone who doesn't particularly expect to be interested, and found myself more interested than I'd predicted. The cost differential was the first thing that caught my attention, because numbers are the lens through which I see most things, and the numbers were genuinely striking. Then the climate, which my Manchester bones had begun to resent in a way they hadn't when I was too busy to notice the weather. Then, more slowly, the quality of a different kind of daily life, the markets, the food, the outdoor living, the sense that retirement here was something other than the managed diminishment I was beginning to feel in Didsbury. I did my research before going, not casually, thoroughly, in the way I do all research, with a structure and a timeline and a set of specific questions I wanted answered. I read expat forums, studied the relevant tax treaty implications, made notes on healthcare provision and costs, looked at the property ownership rules for foreign nationals, read 2 books on the Philippines specifically, and several broader assessments of retirement in Southeast Asia. By the time I booked my first flight, I had a document of 37 pages covering what I knew and what I still needed to find out, which Claire found both impressive and alarming when I showed it to her. She said, "Dad, most people just go and see if they like it." I told her I liked to understand what I was walking into. I went for 6 weeks in my second year of retirement. Stayed in Manila for the first 2 weeks, Cebu for the third and fourth, and then back to Manila for the final fortnight because I'd found things in the capital that I wanted to look at more carefully. I liked the country substantially, more than I'd expected, and I'd set my expectations at a measured level specifically to avoid the kind of disappointed idealism that I'd read about in expat forums where people arrived expecting paradise and discovered reality. What I found was interesting, accessible, affordable in ways that materially expanded what my retirement income could support, and this was the part I hadn't expected to weight as heavily as I did genuinely pleasant in terms of daily human interaction. People in Manila are warm. I don't mean that in a generalizing way. I mean that the specific quality of daily interactions, shopkeepers, market vendors, the man at the coffee shop where I went each morning had a warmth and an easiness that my daily life in Didsbury had not contained for some years. I went back 6 months later for another 4 weeks. At the end of that trip, I spoke to a relocation consultant, a British woman named Sandra Greer, who had been living in Manila for 11 years and who helped newly arrived expats navigate the administrative side of establishing residence, and I told her I was seriously considering making the move. She asked me practical questions about my financial situation and my health and my connections in the UK, and based on my answers, she said she thought I was a good candidate for making it work. She wasn't a salesperson. She told me what would be difficult as clearly as she told me what would be easy. I appreciated that. It was Sandra who first mentioned investment opportunities to me. Not directly, she wasn't in that business and was careful to say so, but she mentioned, in the context of discussing how some expats structured their finances in the Philippines, that there were several local investment advisory services that specialized in helping foreign retirees put their capital to work in ways that generated returns consistent with Philippine market conditions. She gave me 2 names she'd heard mentioned positively in the expat community. One of those names was Gianna Soto. I didn't contact Gianna immediately. That's important to say because it establishes the sequence and because it's relevant to how the whole thing eventually worked. I spent 3 months doing background research on Philippine investment markets, on the regulatory framework for foreign investment, on the tax implications for a UK resident investing through a Philippine-based advisor. I read the relevant sections of Philippine financial regulation. I looked up the registration requirements for investment advisors with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the Philippines and noted what a legitimately registered advisor's credentials should look like. I formed a picture, before I met her, of what I was going to be assessing and how. When I finally arranged a meeting with Gianna Soto, it was in her office in Makati, on a Tuesday morning in my 3rd month of residency in Manila. She was 47 years old, originally from Manila, with 12 years of experience in financial advisory services, or so she said, and so her profile materials indicated. Her office was small but organized. Her credentials were displayed prominently, and I examined them, including the SEC registration certificate. I asked her several technical questions about Philippine investment markets, questions that someone who'd read the materials I'd read would know to ask, but that a typical foreign retiree might not. She answered all of them competently. Not brilliantly, I noticed one answer that was slightly imprecise, but competently enough that I couldn't identify a gap that concerned me. She presented her services as investment advisory, not investment management. The distinction mattered to me professionally. Advisory meant she would recommend and I would decide. Management meant discretionary authority. I was clear at the outset that I wanted advisory services, only that I would be making all final decisions on all transactions, that nothing would move without my explicit written authorization, and that I expected full documentation on every recommended position. She agreed to all of those terms without hesitation. We signed an advisory agreement that reflected them precisely. I want to dwell on that agreement for a moment because it's central to understanding how what happened could happen. The agreement was real. The terms were real. The protections I had negotiated were real. What I didn't understand, and what took me 14 months to begin to understand, was that a sufficiently sophisticated operation can comply with the letter of an agreement while systematically violating its substance, because the letter of an agreement describes the visible surface of a financial relationship and the substance can be conducted in the invisible interior. The first 6 months were clean, or appeared to be. Gianna recommended 4 investment positions, 2 in Philippine government bonds, 1 in a registered unit trust, 1 in a small-cap equity fund. All were legitimate Philippine financial instruments. All were in my name. All were documented with the registrar receipts and confirmation statements that I asked for and received. The returns were modest and consistent with what I'd been led to expect by my own research. I reviewed the statements monthly. I reconciled the figures against my own tracking spreadsheet. I found no discrepancies. At the 6-month mark, I told Claire on our weekly call that I thought the arrangement was working, that the advisor I'd found was professional and careful, and that my capital appeared to be in good hands. Claire asked, in the mild and slightly watchful way she has when she thinks something might be worth a second look, whether I'd had the arrangement independently reviewed. I said I had reviewed it myself. She said, I mean by someone who doesn't have a stake in it. I said I'd think about that. I didn't do it immediately, and by the time I gave that omission any thought, 6 more months had passed and the situation had changed in ways I was not yet aware of. What Gianna was doing during those first 6 months, as I understand it now, was establishing a track record, building a foundation of legitimate activity that I could observe and verify, and that would make me comfortable enough with her professional conduct to let my vigilance, just slightly, ease its grip. She was patient. That patience was not the patience of someone who was not yet ready to steal. It was the patience of someone building the conditions under which stealing at scale would become possible. There is a difference, and the difference is sophisticated. Around the 8th month, the complexity of the recommended portfolio began to increase. Gianna introduced me to what she described as structured investment products, a category I was familiar with in broad terms from my accounting background, where I'd seen clients hold structured notes and certain kinds of derivative-backed instruments. She explained these as higher-yield alternatives to the vanilla positions I'd been holding, with somewhat more complexity in their structure but a commensurately better risk-adjusted return profile. She provided documentation, prospectuses, term sheets, what appeared to be third-party custodian statements from a Philippine bank I could look up and verify was real. I reviewed everything. I asked specific questions about the underlying assets, the counterparty exposure, the liquidity terms. She answered all of them. What I could not have known, and what the subsequent investigation slowly established, was that the documentation she was providing me was a combination of genuine and fabricated. Some of the instruments she described existed, and I owned them. Others existed on paper that she had created and existed nowhere else. The bank statements she showed me for the fabricated positions were not forgeries in a crude sense. They were sophisticated reproductions that matched the formatting, typography, and reference numbering conventions of the real institution closely enough that the difference was not visible to someone reviewing them in the ordinary course of monitoring a portfolio. The errors that would have revealed them were in metadata and in security features that require specialist equipment to test, not in anything a person looking at a printout or even a scanned PDF would find. I didn't find them. I looked, by every standard I knew how to apply. I looked harder than a person without my background would have known to look. I didn't find them because they were assembled by someone who understood what I would look for and had prepared specifically against that scrutiny. By month 10, the total I had invested across the legitimate and fabricated positions was approximately £240,000. A significant allocation of capital, but within the range I had told myself I was comfortable with for this portfolio. I was tracking monthly, reconciling quarterly, maintaining a spreadsheet of expected returns against reported returns that showed consistency. I found reassuring. What I was not doing, what I did not know to do, was attempting to verify the actual existence of the positions independently of the documentation Gianna was providing me, because I didn't yet have any specific reason to do that, and because independent verification of every position in a multi-instrument portfolio was not practically achievable on my own without specialist resources. In month 11, Gianna presented what she described as a time-sensitive opportunity, a pre-IPO allocation in a Philippine technology company, available at a significant discount to the expected listing price, with a locked-up period of 6 months after which the expected gain was substantial. She said the allocation window was 10 days. She said she had access because of her relationship with the lead underwriter. She provided what appeared to be a term sheet, a company profile with audited figures, and a letter from the underwriting bank. She also said the minimum allocation was £90,000. I want to be precise about my state of mind at this point. I did not accept the proposal immediately. I asked for several additional items of documentation. I sat on it for 4 days. I called a contact I still had at a UK financial advisory firm, a man named Gerald Hobbs, who I'd worked with on client matters before I retired, and I described the investment in general terms without identifying the specific company or the advisor, and asked whether the structure he was hearing was consistent with how pre-IPO allocations worked. He said it was broadly consistent, that the mechanics weren't implausible. I went back to Gianna with 2 more specific questions about the company's financial structure. She answered both. On the 5th day, I authorized the investment of £90,000. That transfer did not go into a genuine pre-IPO allocation. That I know now. It went through a route that the financial crimes investigator later described as a layered structure involving 2 intermediary accounts to a destination I have never been able to fully trace. The documentation of the transaction that Gianna provided me was entirely fabricated, and it was fabricated with the same precision as the bank statements I had reviewed for the structured products, enough precision that my monthly review of the portfolio showed a position that appeared to be correctly held and correctly reported. What happened over the next 3 months was the acceleration phase. Looking back at the sequence now, it has the unmistakable shape of a wind, down the pace of new proposed investments increasing, the amounts escalating, the complexity of each instrument's documentation growing. At the time, I experienced it as normal portfolio development, the natural expansion of a working advisory relationship reaching maturity, 2 more structured products, totaling £85,000, a currency-linked note, £55,000. What she described as a secondary market acquisition of a partial interest in a real estate investment trust, £60,000. Each came with documentation. Each was reviewed. Each joined the spreadsheet that I updated every month and that showed me, in organized rows and columns, a portfolio of £370,000 in diversified Philippine investments that appeared to be performing adequately. Then the statements stopped arriving. Not all at once, not dramatically. First, the monthly statement for one of the structured products was late. I messaged Gianna. She said there had been a delay at the custodian bank's reporting department and it would arrive within the week. It arrived within the week, and it was a detailed and well-formatted document that showed the position performing exactly as the previous statements had shown. Then the following month, the same custodian statement was late again. Gianna's explanation was the same. I accepted it, but I noted in my own records that this was the second consecutive delay with the same institution, and I flagged it as something to watch. 3 weeks after that second late statement, I sent Gianna a message asking for updated documentation on all positions across the portfolio. A complete reconciliation, I said, which was something I did periodically anyway and which was not, on its own, a departure from the normal pattern of our working relationship. She replied promptly, said she would compile everything and have it to me within 48 hours. 48 hours passed, then 4 days, then a week. I sent a follow-up message. She replied to say she was dealing with a personal matter and would have everything to me by the end of the week. The end of that week came and nothing arrived. I called her mobile. She answered, apologized, said she had been unwell, said she would send everything Monday. Monday arrived without the documents. I called again. The call went to voicemail. That pattern, the delay, the partial response, the reason that was plausible enough to accept once, and questionable the second time, and clearly evasive the third, lasted for 3 weeks. Each week I escalated slightly. I sent emails with specific requests and specific deadlines. I left voicemails. I visited the office in Makati on a Thursday and found the reception desk unstaffed, the office behind it visibly less occupied than it had been on my previous visits. One desk bare, where there had been a computer, a bookshelf with gaps where documents had been. A woman I didn't recognize told me Miss Soto was not available and would be in touch. She was not in touch. On the following Tuesday, I went back to the office with Sandra Greer, who had referred me to Gianna in the first place and who by this point was as alarmed as I was, though she was careful to say she had no direct knowledge of any wrongdoing and was there only as a familiar face who knew the context. The office was locked. A notice on the door said the lease had been terminated. The building management, when Sandra spoke to them, said the tenant had vacated 11 days earlier without advance notice. I sat in Sandra's car outside that building for a while. I remember the traffic moving on the street in front of us. I remember Sandra saying, "Ethan, I'm so sorry," which was an acknowledgement that we were both beyond the stage of uncertainty. I called Claire from the car. She answered and knew from my voice before I said anything that something was wrong. I told her what I knew in as measured a tone as I could manage, which was difficult because what I knew was that I had, by all current evidence, lost a very significant amount of money to a woman I had spent 14 months carefully evaluating as trustworthy. Claire said, "How much are we talking about, Dad?" I said approximately £370,000. There was a silence on her end that lasted several seconds. Then she said, "I'm coming to Manila." I said I didn't need her to come. She said, "I know you don't need me to. I'm coming anyway." The investigation that followed, conducted initially by a financial crimes unit of the Philippine National Police and subsequently supplemented by a private forensic accounting firm that Claire and I engaged on the recommendation of a solicitor back in Manchester, took several months to reconstruct what had actually happened. I am not going to describe all of it in technical detail because some of it is still part of ongoing proceedings and some of it is genuinely complex in ways that resist clean summary. What I can describe is the shape of it, which was this. Of the £370,000 I had invested, approximately £95,000 was in genuine positions that continued to exist. The remainder had either been diverted at the point of initial investment, meaning the money I transferred for a purported investment never reached that investment, or had been gradually withdrawn from real positions over the monitoring period through a mechanism that the forensic accountant described as systematic skimming, where small amounts were removed from real accounts at intervals calculated to stay below the threshold that would produce a visible discrepancy against the statements I was reviewing. The statements themselves were partly genuine, reflecting the real positions, and partly fabricated additions that showed holdings that did not exist or showed balances higher than the actual ones for positions that did. The sophistication of the fabrication was, the forensic accountant told me without any apparent awareness of how this landed, impressive from a technical standpoint. He said he had worked on investment fraud cases for 19 years, and the document quality in my case was in the top 10% of what he had encountered. He said the statement reproduction specifically would have fooled most professional investors, let alone private clients. He said this, I think, to be reassuring. It was not particularly reassuring. Knowing that I had been defrauded by someone exceptionally good at deception did not make the deception easier to accept. Claire spent 10 days in Manila. She is 44 years old, works as a financial analyst in Leeds, and has inherited from me a certain methodical quality that in this situation was genuinely useful. She sat with the investigation materials, asked the forensic accountant the questions I should have asked him but was too close to the situation to formulate clearly, and gave me an honest picture of what the recovery prospects looked like. The honest picture was difficult. The £95,000 in genuine positions was recoverable and was being recovered through a straightforward process. The remaining £275,000, having been moved through layered accounts, was in a jurisdiction and a form that made tracing and recovery slow and uncertain. She said the criminal case had merit, the documentation evidence was strong, but that I should not make any financial plans predicated on recovery of the full loss. I told her I understood that. She looked at me the way Claire has looked at me since she was a child when she thinks I am processing something less fully than I am presenting. She said, "Dad, how are you actually doing?" I said I was fine. She said, "I know what fine means when you say it." I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, "I'm struggling with a specific thing. Not the money, the checking. I checked. I looked at everything I knew how to look at, and it wasn't enough." She said, "No, it wasn't." She didn't try to make that better. That was, in hindsight, the right response. Making it better would have been dishonest, and we are not a family that deals in comfortable dishonesty. The specific thing I have been struggling with, the thing I told Claire and have continued to turn over in the months since, is the failure of competence as protection. I came to this situation with a professional background that gave me tools that most people in my position would not have had. I used those tools. I applied the diligence I would have applied on behalf of a client, and the diligence was insufficient not because it was poorly executed, but because it was working against a method designed specifically to defeat it. That is not a comfortable thing to hold. The comfortable version would be if I had been lazy or inattentive, or if there were obvious red flags I had glossed over in a fog of optimism. Then there would be a lesson with a clear shape. Be more careful. Don't be lazy. Trust your instincts. But the uncomfortable version, the accurate version, is that my carefulness itself was anticipated and used against me. Gianna, or whoever designed the methodology she was using, understood that a careful investor asks certain questions and reviews certain documents and cross-references certain figures. And so the fake documentation was designed to satisfy those specific questions and those specific reviews and those specific cross-references. My diligence was not a protection. It was a calibration tool she used to make sure the fabrications were convincing enough to pass the level of scrutiny she knew I would apply. Sandra Greer came to see me about a month after the investigation findings were shared with me. She was visibly distressed about her role in having referred me to Gianna, which I told her was not something she should carry. She said she had checked what she could check, had asked other expats, had heard nothing negative, had formed a view based on what was visible to her. I said I understood that. She said something that has stayed with me. "Ethan, she didn't steal from you because she found a gap in your checking. She stole from you because she built a gap and hid it inside your checking. That formulation was better than anything I'd come up with on my own. The gap was not pre-existing. It was constructed. Inside the space created by my own diligence, by the things I was looking at and therefore not questioning, she had built a structure that was invisible precisely because I was looking so carefully at the things surrounding it." Gerald Hobbs, my old contact in Manchester, called me once the story had become known in my professional circle. He asked how I was, and I told him honestly. He said he had been thinking about the case from a technical standpoint and wanted to know if I was willing to discuss it, not for any purpose other than his own understanding. I said I was. We spent an hour on the phone. At the end, he said, "Ethan, the error wasn't in your verification process. It was in your verification scope. You were verifying within the framework she provided. You needed to verify the framework itself." I asked what that would have looked like practically. He said it would have meant engaging an independent custodian to hold and report on the positions, so that the documentation of what you owned was coming from an entity with no relationship to the advisor. He said this is standard practice for institutional investors and something that private clients almost never do because it adds cost and complexity that seems unnecessary when you trust the advisor. I said it wasn't something I had known to require. He said he knew that. He said most experienced professionals wouldn't have known to require it either, because the threat it protects against is uncommon enough that it's not a standard part of private client practice. He said, "You weren't ignorant. You were operating at the edge of what standard professional practice covers, and she was operating past it." That conversation with Gerald helped me more than almost anything else in this period, not because it absolved me of responsibility for the loss, but because it located the failure accurately. I had done everything within the domain of what I knew to do. The gap was in what I didn't know to do. The lesson was not about vigilance. It was about the limits of any individual's knowledge in a sufficiently sophisticated adversarial context, and about the structural protections that exist specifically to address those limits. Claire found a flat for me in a quieter part of BGC while she was still in Manila. She said she was not going to let me make a decision about returning to Manchester while I was in the middle of processing the fraud, and that the flat gave me a neutral space to make that decision from. I moved in and I've been here since. I haven't decided about Manchester yet, not definitively, and I find that non-decision less troubling than I expected. The Philippines, stripped of the investment advisory relationship that had been absorbing a significant amount of my attention, is still the country I came to for reasons that remain valid. The climate is still this climate. The cost of living is still materially better than Didsbury. The daily life is still, when I allow myself to experience it rather than sitting with the investigation materials, genuinely pleasant. I have been doing something over the past several months that I would not have predicted myself doing, which is talking to other expats about this. Not seeking sympathy, I don't find sympathy very useful, which is a personality characteristic Claire has noted in me more than once. Seeking information. I have been mapping, in a loose and informal way, what other people in similar situations did or didn't do, what protections they had or lacked, what they know now that they didn't know then. I have found, in those conversations, that the gap, Gerald identified the gap between what standard vigilance covers and what sophisticated fraud can exploit is not an anomaly. It is a known space in private investor experience, and there are real structural protections against it that most private clients don't know exist and don't think to require. The independent custodian arrangement that Gerald described is one of them. When an advisor recommends an investment and you authorize it, the money can be sent to a custodian of your own choosing, a separate, independent institution that holds the asset and reports on it directly to you, with no connection to the advisor. The advisor has no ability to influence or fabricate those reports because they come from an entity they don't control. It adds cost. It adds a layer of administrative complexity. It is the single most effective structural protection against exactly what happened to me. And if I had required it from the outset, I would have caught the fabricated positions in month 1 because the independent custodian would have reported holdings that didn't match what Gianna was telling me she had invested in. I've shared this with several people now. Not as a warning about the Philippines specifically, I want to be careful about that framing because it's inaccurate and potentially unfair to a country and a community that contains, as any country does, both honest people and dishonest ones. What happened to me was not a Philippines problem. It was a fraud problem. And fraud problems exist in every jurisdiction and in every investment environment. What is specific to the Philippines is that it is an environment in which a foreign retiree is likely to be navigating an unfamiliar regulatory landscape with lower baseline knowledge of the normal standards and practices, which makes it easier for a bad actor to stay within the plausible range. That's a structural vulnerability that applies to any foreign environment, not this one specifically. Gianna was found. I should say that plainly, because it matters. The Philippine National Police investigation identified her through a combination of the financial documentation trail and information from other people who had been defrauded in similar ways by the same operation there were. As the investigation established, at least 4 other foreign national clients who had lost money through her. She was arrested approximately 4 months after the investigation began. The criminal case is proceeding. I have given a full statement. I have provided all documentation I hold. Addie. Cruz, the Filipino solicitor Claire helped me engage, is handling the case professionally and has been honest about what a successful prosecution does and doesn't mean for financial recovery. I have recovered the £95,000 in genuine positions. I expect no more than partial recovery of the remainder, and that recovery will arrive slowly if it arrives at all. The financial picture going forward is materially reduced from what I had planned. I am still comfortable in the sense of not being in hardship, but the margin I had built and expected to maintain is significantly diminished, and the life I can sustain in Manila is smaller than the life I thought I was building. I have adjusted my expectations without resentment, or at least without resentment that I can't manage. Managing it takes some effort on some days. Claire calls twice a week now instead of once. This is not something she asked or that I asked for. It simply became the new pattern after her visit, and neither of us has moved to change it. On the second call each week she asks, with the precision of someone who has thought about the question, not how I am generally, but what I've been doing specifically. She wants the details, who I've spoken to, where I've been, what I've been reading, what I'm thinking about. I have come to understand that she is not monitoring me in a patronizing sense. She is keeping me in conversation, which is different and which is something I apparently needed more than I knew. I have a morning routine now that I built deliberately in the months after the investigation resolved, because I understand my own psychology well enough to know that structure is what I use to keep myself functional when things are difficult. Coffee at 7. A walk along the BGC commercial strip at 7:30, when the shops are opening and the city has the particular quality it has before the heat of the day arrives. Reading from 8 until 10, I have been working through a history of modern financial regulation, which is either a productive response to my experience or a version of returning to the scene of the crime, depending on how you choose to frame it. Then, whatever the day requires, I've been thinking about what I'd say to someone in my situation, someone who is approaching this kind of thing with the caution that I brought to it and who wants to know what more they can do. The honest answer is that the standard caution, reviewing statements, asking questions, cross-referencing figures is necessary but not sufficient against a sophisticated operator. The sufficient version requires structural protections that place the verification outside the control of the person being verified, independent custodianship, periodic independent audits by a third party with no connection to the advisor, a clear delineation at the outset between advisory authority and any form of execution authority, with the execution authority held independently. These things add cost and friction. They also close the space that cost me £370,000. I called Gerald last week, not about the case that's been handed to the solicitors and will take its course without my involvement, just to talk. We spoke for an hour about things that had nothing to do with the Philippines or with Gianna Soto, which was its own form of progress. At the end of the call, he said, "Ethan, for what it's worth, the way you've handled this is more impressive than you probably realize." I said I didn't feel particularly impressive. He said, "I know. That's why it's impressive." I thought about that for a while after the call ended. I'm still thinking about it. There is a version of what happened to me that I could tell as a story about being fooled, about the arrogance of a retired accountant who thought his professional background immunized him against a category of risk it turned out he didn't fully understand. That version is true, partly. I was overconfident about the scope of what my background protected me against. I should have known or found someone who knew about independent custodianship from the outset. But there is another version that is also true, which is that a highly intelligent person spent months studying what I would look for and building a system designed to pass every test I could apply. That version doesn't make me blameless. It does make me something other than simply foolish. It makes me a person who operated at the outer edge of available professional knowledge and encountered something past that edge. There is a distinction there that I have been working to hold on to, not as self-protection but as accuracy. Getting the story right matters to me more than it probably should, given how little the accuracy of the story changes the financial reality. But accuracy is the thing I have always cared most about, professionally and personally, and losing £370,000 has not changed that. I'm 74 years old. I'm living in a flat in BGC that is smaller than I planned for, but that suits me. With a morning routine I've built deliberately and a weekly call pattern with Claire that has improved our communication in ways I wouldn't have predicted. I have a case in the Philippine criminal courts proceeding at its own pace. I have £95,000 recovered and the rest subject to the long uncertainty of a traced but contested financial investigation. And I have, for the first time in 41 years of professional life, encountered a problem I could not solve by looking at it carefully enough. That is an unusual and humbling experience for a man whose entire career was built on the proposition that careful looking produces correct conclusions. The conclusion I've arrived at is not that careful looking is useless. It is that careful looking has to be aimed at the right things, and the right things include not just the content of what you're reviewing, but the source and independence of the review materials themselves. If the documents you're checking can be controlled by the person you're checking on, the checking is incomplete regardless of how thorough it is. That's the lesson. 14 months, £370,000, and the work of one very patient and very capable woman who understood that the safest place to steal from a careful man is not the place he isn't looking. It's the place he is looking, adjusted to show him what he needs to see. The light here in the mornings is still good. The walk at 7:30 is still what it is. Claire calls twice a week. I am, by my own honest accounting, managing. Some days that is more than enough. Some days it requires the whole of what I have to give it. Both are real. Both are mine, and I have spent a long enough career doing honest accounting to know the difference between a number that's correct and a number that merely looks right. I know which one I'm working with now. Sandra Greer and I have become closer since all of this happened, which is not the outcome either of us would have predicted when she was apologizing to me in her car outside Gianna's vacated office. She carries a guilt about the referral that I have tried, without complete success, to talk her out of. Her logic is that she was the link in the chain that connected me to Gianna, and therefore the chain is partly her responsibility. My logic is that she referred me based on the available information she had at the time, which was positive community reputation and the absence of any negative evidence, and that this is both a reasonable basis for a referral and demonstrably insufficient in a world where someone like Gianna can maintain a positive community reputation for years by only defrauding people once and then moving on before the complaints accumulate. The chain of responsibility runs to the person who committed the fraud, not to the person whose inadvertent introduction made the meeting possible. Sandra accepts this intellectually and doesn't entirely accept it emotionally. I understand that. It's how I feel about the authorization I signed for the £90,000 pre-IPO transfer. Intellectually, I know the authorization was based on manufactured evidence I had no practical way to disprove. Emotionally, I still signed it, and it still went somewhere it shouldn't have gone, and the signature is mine, and that is not nothing. We had dinner last month, Sandra and her husband and I, at a place she and her husband know in Poblacion, where the food is genuinely good, and the ambience is the kind of relaxed outdoor setting that makes Manila feel, on the right evening, like a very good idea. We talked about things that weren't the fraud for most of the meal, which was a relief for all three of us. At the end of the evening, her husband, a quiet and sensible man named Philip, who has lived in Manila for 15 years and has the settled quality of someone who has genuinely made peace with his life, said something I've been holding on to. He said, "The Philippines doesn't get smaller after something like this happens to you. Some people let it get smaller. That's a choice." I said I understood what he meant. He said, "Good. Come back for dinner when you're ready to talk about something else." I'm going to go back for dinner. That is itself a kind of answer to the question I've been holding about whether I stay or go. Gerald forwarded me an article last month, published in a UK financial advice trade publication, about independent custody arrangements for private investors in emerging markets. The article described, in terms that overlap precisely with what the forensic accountant had reconstructed about Gianna's method, the vulnerability that an advisor-controlled documentation chain creates and the structural protection that independent custodianship provides. The article was written by someone with no knowledge of my case. It described my situation or a situation exactly like mine as a known and documented category of investment fraud. Reading it produced two simultaneous feelings. One was the recognition that comes from seeing your own experience accurately described. The other was something harder to name, something between sadness and frustration that this knowledge existed in a published form somewhere in the professional literature and that I had never encountered it in 41 years of working with investment products, because the private client investment advisory world in which it was relevant was not the sector of accounting work I had done, and the gap between what I knew and what this required knowing was precisely the width of the space Gianna had worked in. I sent the article to Claire. She read it and called me immediately, not at our scheduled time, but the same afternoon. She said, "Dad, you should talk to someone about this publicly. Not about what happened to you specifically, but about what the article describes and how it applies to people in your position." I asked what she meant by publicly. She said she had been talking to a contact in financial journalism who wrote about consumer protection issues and who had expressed interest in the gap between standard private client protections and the specific vulnerabilities that exist in offshore advisory relationships for foreign retirees. She said my experience, framed not as a victim account but as a structural analysis from someone with professional knowledge, might be useful to other people in similar situations. I thought about that for several days. I told her I'd consider it. I am still considering it. There is something in me that resists the public framing, the same resistance I've always had to making my professional life visible in a personal way. And there is something else in me that understands what Claire is pointing at, that the specific configuration of knowledge I have now, professional accounting background plus the experience of being systematically defrauded despite that background, is a combination that is genuinely uncommon and that has a particular kind of usefulness to someone who is considering a similar situation and doesn't know what questions to ask. The questions to ask, if I were advising someone going into this, would be these: who holds custody of the assets you and your advisor, or an independent institution that neither of you controls? Can you verify the positions directly with the custodian, without the documents going through your advisor first? Is the advisor registered with the relevant regulatory authority? And have you verified that registration through the authority's own database rather than through documentation provided by the advisor? Is the advisory agreement explicit about the limit of the advisor's authority? And does that limit include execution authority? And this is the one that my conversation with Gerald crystallized: who bears the risk if the documentation turns out to be false? In my case, the answer to that last question was, I did, entirely, because I had no independent verification that the documentation wasn't what it appeared to be. In a properly structured arrangement, the answer should be nobody, because the documentation comes from a source whose independence makes falsification practically impossible. These are not exotic questions. They are questions that sophisticated institutional investors ask as a matter of routine. They are questions that private clients, even sophisticated ones, almost never ask because the advice culture around private investment doesn't surface them. That cultural gap is where frauds like Gianna's live. Claire visited again last month. Shorter trip this time, a long weekend, more social than functional. She brought photographs of her two boys that she insisted on showing me on her phone, even though I've seen a great many photographs of my grandsons in the past year. We went to the Poblacion restaurant Sandra had taken me to. We walked along the BGC promenade on the Saturday evening when it was full of the particular cheerful density of Manila on a weekend, which is something I have always found invigorating even on the days when I am less invigorated by other things. She said, at one point during that walk, "You seem better than I expected." I asked what she had expected. She said, "Someone more defeated." I said I didn't think defeated was the useful response. She said, "I know. That's why I said better than I expected." On the last morning of her visit, we had coffee on my small balcony, which looks east and catches the early light in a way I've come to value. She asked me, in the careful way she has when she's been working up to something, whether I'd started thinking about what came next. Not recovery, she meant. The next thing I was going to do. I said I'd been thinking about it. She said, "And?" I said I'd been in contact with a local university's business school that ran a program for small business operators and that had been looking for guest lecturers with practical accounting and financial management backgrounds. Nothing formal had been agreed, but there had been conversations, and the conversations had felt like something worth continuing. Claire looked at me for a moment with an expression that I recognized as the specific expression she has when she decides not to say whatever she was about to say and instead says something smaller. She said, "Good." I said, "That's it?" She said, "That's it, Dad. Good. I'm going to call the university contact this week. The morning routine holds. The walk at 7:30 holds. The twice-weekly calls hold. The case proceeds at its own pace, and I receive updates from Addie. Cruise with the measured equanimity I've been cultivating since the investigation findings settled into their permanent shape. I'm 74 years old, and I have been careful my whole professional life, and the carefulness was insufficient against one specific, unusual, sophisticated adversary, and that is a fact I carry with the same honesty I've always tried to apply to inconvenient facts. Not with drama, not with self-pity, with the accountant's dry acknowledgement that the number is what the number is, and the question is what you do next. What I do next is get up in the morning, walk when the light is right, talk to Claire twice a week, call the university this week, and maintain, against the evidence of what happened, the position that a careful person is better off in the world than a careless one, not because caution is a guarantee, because it clearly isn't, but because caution aimed at the right things, structured with the right independent protections, is as close to a guarantee as the world actually offers. It wasn't enough this time. I'm going to make it enough going forward. That will have to do. At 74, in a city that is warm and complicated and entirely itself, in a life that is smaller than the one I planned and more honest than the one I thought I was living, that will have to do. And most mornings, if I'm truthful about it, it does.